Good morning, and welcome to this, our third lecture in our public theology series this academic year. These lectures are intended to assist Garrett Evangelical community to understand more about the intersection of theological perspectives and values with the needs of the world as we continue to prepare graduates who are equipped to serve in the public sphere for the well-being of all persons and creation. This year, the President's Office sponsors the series in honor of the celebration of the 45th anniversary of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience. As you know, the events of Ferguson 2014 and the continuing violence against the personhood and the bodies of our black brothers and sisters resulted in the Black Lives Matter movement and a new kind of civil rights activism in our country. It is my privilege and honor to introduce today the Reverend Dr. Michael Neighbors, the new pastor at historic Second Baptist Church here in Evanston. Dr. Neighbors has a remarkable capacity and embodiment to work within and at the intersections of congregational ministry, community leadership, formation of persons from both the church and the academy, and to teach in theological education. Most recently, Dr. Neighbors served as director of the Master of Divinity and Student Life programs at Ecumenical Theological Center in Detroit, Seminary, I should say. It was Center when we worked with them a little earlier to get the full ATS accreditation. And he was the professor of homiletics and African American religious history there. Dr. Neighbors has also taught at Ashland Theological Seminary, Calvin Theological Seminary, and Marygrove College for the past 10 years. His primary academic interest is in helping students practice homiletical preparation for preaching in the changing world of the 21st century. Dr. Brooks, there's help on the way. Here you go. He has used Samuel Proctor's Hegelian dialectic, Paul Scott Wilson's 4 pages of the sermon, and William Buechner's literary genre as a foundation for his preaching courses. Dr. Neighbors has also served a number of churches along the way. His primary church interest has been in building bridges to erase the gap between community and university, the African American religious experience, and the academy. He's already established a new interfaith initiative between Second Baptist and Temple Shalom to develop a unique interfaith suburban-urban partnership that addresses racial inequities in the city of Chicago. One of their first cooperative efforts was to bring social justice advocate Brian Stevenson to Chicago to discuss these racial inequities in the justice system. Second Baptist continues a strong relationship with Beth Emmett of Evanston to build bridges with various ethnic and cultural groups in Evanston to overcome disparities. Dr. Neighbors earned his undergraduate degree in English and Creative Writing at Western Michigan University. He earned the Master of Divinity and Master of Theology degrees at Princeton Theological Seminary, where Mark Taylor was his advisor. He completed a Doctor of Ministry degree as a Samuel DeWitt Proctor Fellow at United Theological, with a final project entitled Preaching in a Multicultural Setting, an examination of African American pastors preaching at Miller Chapel, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Dr. DeWitt Proctor chaired his committee. Dr. Neighbors has been a fellow in the Sustaining Pastoral Excellence Program of the Lilly Endowment, as well as a fellow in the Pastor Theologian Program led by the Institute of Theological Study. Dr. Neighbors has received over 100 community, church, and ministry awards for leadership and service in New Jersey and Michigan. Before leaving Princeton, the mayor and city council commemorated his leadership by naming October 12th as Dr. Michael Neighbors Day. He has been president of the Princeton and Trenton, New Jersey branches of the NAACP, the Michigan Progressive Baptist Convention, and chairman of the board for Detroit East Incorporated and Gateway Community Health. We were extremely fortunate to be able to engage Dr. Neighbors in co-teaching our public theology course this past fall with Dr. Dave Frinchak, who's over here. The course met at Second Baptist and in the community with various leaders. As we have reported earlier, our students joined members of Second Baptist for the course and worked on race relations in Evanston. There is no question but that Garrett Evangelical has an exciting new partner in Evanston, and I am confident of our relationship that it will be strengthened over the years to come. So, Dr. Neighbors, we look forward to hearing your lecture, Race Matters Through the Lenses of a Local Pastor, and we will be eager to engage with you in some dialogue following your address. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. There is no way in the world that I or anyone can ever live up to that amazing introduction. You heard in it that I majored in English with an emphasis in creative writing, and one of the distinct privileges of having that background is this. You have an opportunity to write your own introductions. And so I was very creative, and you read everything that I wrote. I thank you very much. So it is an honor and a privilege. I'm delighted by the opportunity to have been extended this amazing invitation by Dr. Rector and to members who are here of the faculty and staff and the administration and students who are present. It's just good to be in this place. She mentioned one of my academic mentors, Samuel DeWitt Proctor, and he would often say on occasions like this that it is good to have people remind you about who you are. And then he would also go on to share this story, which I think is important after hearing that kind of introduction. He shared that he was once returning from a visit to the United Nations where he had the opportunity to address an open session in Geneva. And when he returned home later that week, he couldn't wait to tell his wife, Bessie, about all the hoopla that had surrounded that occasion. He was what you would say in today's vernacular, feeling himself. He flew into LaGuardia Airport in New York, caught the train downtown New Brunswick, New Jersey, and caught a cab home to Somerset. It was late, and Bessie was up waiting for him, and he couldn't wait to begin. Honey, he said, you will never believe. Wait a minute, Sam, Bessie said. The garbage needs to be taken out. They're picking it up in the morning. He said he hung his head down, the locks of his shoulders, and recognized, I'm just dust. It's important for all of us to recognize that we are just dust, no matter what the accolades are, no matter how we feel about ourselves or about others. We are just dust. It's a wonderful, gentle reminder that no matter how high we rise, how eloquent our words, how ingratiating and endearing the audience, we have to take the garbage out in the morning. And so what I would like to do is I would like to do this in two parts. And I am just becoming accustomed to information technology, and I've gotten excited about it. I have a daughter who is a 17-year-old, and she taught me about PowerPoints and slide presentations and all of that. And I'm trained just to be a preacher, a Baptist preacher. And so she taught me all of that, and I put together this slide presentation. It's my first. And I'm excited about it. But what I haven't been able to do is I haven't been able to successfully merge the slide presentation with the lecture. And so I'm going to go through the slide presentation first, quickly, and then I'm going to give the lecture. One of these days, by and by, it will all come together. But right now, we're going to do it that way. So I've been asked by Dr. Rector to participate in this grand opportunity, and what I'd like to do is go through the lecture a little bit to help you see where I am and how I have come to this understanding about race matters through my own particularity, through the glasses that I wear as an African-American pastor. So I'd like to go through this very quickly and to share with you sort of what has shaped me. And I was shaped by the first congregation that I served. It was First Baptist Church of Princeton. And I started there as a student minister. For any students who are here, I was a student minister under the former pastor whose name was Edward Smith. And I started in that capacity. A year later, he became very, very sick. He died 2 years later, and by my third year, they were looking for the next pastor. And I thought that they were doing a national, international search. You know, they said, we're going to do a national, international search, and we're going to find the right person for the right job. And so that made me feel really good that I would be competitive with all of these other people. But of course, I'm not so sure it was a national, international search. I live right around the corner, so I don't think they had to go very far. So the church was founded in 1886, one of 4 African-American houses of worship in the community. Early members came primarily from Virginia and North Carolina, and you will note that the migration for African Americans out of the Deep South usually went straight up according to the railroad tracks. Early members of the church were often dependent upon their employers for increasing opportunities given to the next generations. They worked so that their children would have better lives and better opportunities to succeed. A growing detachment of younger generation of blacks from the Princeton community meant that the community would begin to suffer in many different ways, as well as the houses of worship there. So in all of this, my perspective is that race factored in as a young pastor more than any of the other current issues that existed during the day in Princeton. So then a couple of more pieces. That was the nice little church I served. It still looks exactly like that. And then we have Princeton, New Jersey, and the church was in the center of the town. You had Princeton University, Princeton Theological Seminary, you had Westminster Choir College, you had a beautiful downtown that sat upon Nassau Street, and just beyond Nassau Street was the beginning of the African American community. It was an amazing kind of experience because it was predominantly black when I arrived there in the 1980s. Now it is no longer predominantly black, it's predominantly white and Latino. The Princeton Plan began in 1949, and it was the first concerted plan by a municipality in the country to desegregate the schools. Race matters, divides the town in a myriad of different ways. It did then and now. The challenges related to race, our academic achievement gap, reading issues for minority children, behavioral issues cited among minority children, affordable housing, and police arrests and altercations. Even in a beautiful, small university town like Princeton, these issues exist. And here's a part of the beauty. I don't know if you can see that. That's sort of Palmer Square as an aerial view of the town. That's a part of the university right there. This is sort of the beginning of the African American neighborhood. I went online and couldn't find a single picture of the African American neighborhood. I just found other more beautiful pictures of other parts of the community. After serving there for a period of time, I left, and the next charge that I had was New Calvary Baptist Church of Detroit. It was founded in 1949. The church was purchased by the first group of African Americans who founded New Calvary from a church that was called St. Matthias German Evangelical Lutheran Church. They had built a beautiful building that accommodated about 1,500 persons. There was also an amazing social hall with first-class commercial kitchen and an auditorium that accommodated another 400 persons. When they first started in 1949, their Sunday school numbered 600 persons. The Sunday school. That's pretty amazing. They experienced significant growth from 1950 to 1970. In 1971, Coleman Alexander Young joined the church, and 2 years later, he would be the mayor of the city of Detroit for 18 years. Focus on preparing following generations with a high school diploma to work in one of the big 3 auto companies was really the nature of that church, and also a majority of the churches in the city of Detroit. Folks were not necessarily thinking about tracking their children to higher education, because if you were able to graduate from high school and go straight into the auto industry, you would probably be making $25 or $30 an hour, and that was 40 years ago, and that was good money. It was not only good money, but it was an opportunity for them to raise their families, to purchase a home. And of course, if you're working in the auto industry, they made sure that you bought a car at least every 2 years. Amen. Sort of tenant farming and sharecropping concept, if you understand that. Diminishing population began, I think, in 1970, really, due to urban issues related to crime and violence, drugs, housing stock, limited employment. The church population in the city begins to diminish with the diminishing population of the city. So in 1980, there were probably about 1.2 million people in the city, and I just looked at the most recent demographics from last year, and it is about 690,000. And the population is going. In my estimation, again, as a pastor, a little older, the primary issue that I had to deal with was related to race factors. And that was a picture of the church, I'm sorry. I told you this is my first time. Yeah, not a good picture, but a picture. And then all of this information deals with Detroit, and I want to go down to the bottom where it talks about tremendous racial unrest. Riots occurred in Detroit on a regular basis. We normally only remember the riot of 1967, but the first riot actually occurred in 1867. There was another riot that occurred in the 1920s when a medical doctor, Dr. Osane Sweet, purchased a home on the east side of Detroit, outside of Black Bottom, where blacks were normally encouraged to purchase their homes or to live. And when he purchased that home, the neighbors decided that they would oust he and his family. And so one evening they came for Dr. Sweet, who had 6 brothers, and they all had shotguns. And so that didn't end very well. And so that was one of the first riots also in the 1920s. But the 2 major riots, one in 1943, lasted 3 days. Thousands of federal troops were called in. Dramatic increase in population when auto industries were turned into the war effort was a part of the unrest that occurred in the population. People were not being paid, and employment was low. 34 people were killed, 25 of them were black, and most of them were killed by police or guardsmen. 433 people were injured, 75% of them were black, and there was $2 million worth of damage done in the city, and in 2015 dollars, that would equate to $30 million. That's 1943. The big one that many of us remember was the riot of 1967, often called the 12th Street Riot. It occurred after a police raid of an after-hours bar called the Blind Pig. It was the deadliest riot in United States history. Governor George Romney, his daddy. Yeah, you all know Mitt, yeah. Yeah, he grew up right there in Michigan, in Detroit. The governor called the Michigan National Guard. President Johnson sent the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. By the time it was all over, 43 people were dead, 1,189 were injured, and there were 7,200 arrests, 2,000 buildings were destroyed, and Detroit would never again be the same. And one believes, from my vantage point, that race factored into the tragedy that we're talking about here with regard to the riots. So here a beautiful picture of Detroit, current Detroit. It's downtown, it's on the riverfront, so it's called the Renaissance Center. It really is gorgeous. There's the river. On the other side is Canada. So you have the Ambassador Bridge joining 2 countries together. However, Detroit is not the same anymore. And for any of you who have had an opportunity to visit there, there are great swaths of abandonment in every single neighborhood, on every single part of town. You have to imagine a grid for a city being built to accommodate, in its heyday, 1.85 million people in the 1930s. And now they have under 700,000 people. So you just have to imagine, you have to do the math. You know, something happens with all of those homes, all of those buildings. Imagine the school grid for public schools. For the public school system, there were at least 260 schools that were built to accommodate 220,000 students in its heyday. The public school students who populated Detroit public schools last year was about 56,000. 220,000 to that number. So it's disappointing, it's tragic, and again, in my humble opinion, the reality is race factors. And then here I am in my old age. Dr. Rector said I had over 100 awards. I do, but you know, that's just saying that I'm old. That's all that's saying. It's not saying anything else. You know, I've lived a while. That's what that is. But Second Baptist Church, founded in 1882, not far from here. Its founding was from a break with the First Baptist Church of Evanston for the purpose of worship, being free from racism and discrimination. First Baptist Church no longer exists. It's now called the Lake Street Church of Evanston. They were not allowed, the early folks who founded the church were not allowed to build on land owned by Nathan Branch, one of the founders, on Wesley Street near Lake Street, near the corner. They wanted to build the church right there, but the neighbors said, we will not allow that to happen, and that was around 1900. Northwestern offered a 20-year lease on land on Benson near Church Street, and that's how the church wound up being there. So you would think that that was simply a philanthropic gesture, but if you go a little bit deeper, you'll probably find that Northwestern wanted to avoid any kind of racial unrest that was beginning to happen in other places, and so they decided, okay, yes, what we'll do is we'll offer this lease on a piece of land that nobody seems to want, but guess what? Everybody wants that land now. So the church was initially comprised of members who were primarily domestic workers to wealthy families in Evanston. There were also some independent businessmen and businesswomen in the congregation, and we have some businesses that actually go back almost 100 years. Significant focus on preparing following generations through education and higher education. It's a little different than what we experienced in Detroit. And again, for all of the issues that we are facing at Second Baptist Church, I contend that through the lenses of a local pastor, front and center remains the issue of race factors. So here's the church. Here's information about Evanston, the birthplace of Northwestern University and Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. It was a suburb for well-to-do Chicagoans after the Great Fire. When they felt that they could no longer be safe down in Chicago, a great many of the very successful folks in Chicago moved up to the Evanston area. It's also a town for Negroes leaving the South in search for greater opportunities. Two towns begin to grow due to race matters. Two towns. We call it Evanston, but they're two towns. Contemporary issues include housing, academic achievement gap, employment opportunities, concerns for the future, all of that. So here we have the beautiful aerial view, my favorite bookstore in all the world. I hope it's your favorite bookstore in all the world after the seminary's bookstore. And that is the Evanston High School, and not very good. And this is an old picture that I found in an old magazine that was on the internet, and the line that you see is called the racial divide. And this was actually a picture, it was a cartoon picture that came out in the New York Times during the summer of 1919, which was also called the Red Summer. The number of riots that occurred when Negro soldiers came back from World War I and decided that they would not put up with the very same kind of thing that they left. And so that was that. So what I'd like to do now is take a shift, if I can. I'm going to exit the show, and all right. So here we go. Are we ready now? Here we go. Thank you. Thank you. Need somebody like that at Second Baptist too. We can't have him. We can contract with him, can we? Can we contract with him? So. Again, so far, you all, during this lecture series, you've had an opportunity to hear two brilliant minds who have offered both sage wisdom and critical advice regarding current affairs in our nation and world. Dr. Leah Gunning Francis from Eden Theological Seminary spoke about Ferguson at the intersection of faith and justice, and Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey of Boston University School of Theology spoke about freedom and blackness exploring theology and self-identity in the midst of activism. Our role here today is to create a slight shift in the atmosphere, as they say these days. Rather than approach the subject matter for today from a scholarly or academic perspective, I felt compelled to talk about race matters through the lenses of a local pastor. For it is one thing to offer a panoramic view of our nation's landscape when it comes to race from the crucial perspective and analysis of the academy. But it is another thing altogether to look at our current state of affairs through the eyes of a pastor whose primary purpose is to be on the front lines. The pastor is responsible for engaging with the people who struggle to maintain sanity, self-confidence, and the assurance that their salvation is not only eternal, but that it has temporal ramifications as well. One of my favorite books over the past few years has been Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. In its opening pages, he writes these words: "The task of the prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us." These words intrigued me and helped me understand anew the inaugural address of our Lord, who stood in his hometown synagogue and read, "In a new way, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor and to set at liberty those who are oppressed." That is, from my perspective, an alternative to the consciousness and the perception of the dominant culture of his day. Brueggemann goes on to describe the alternate styles of leadership in his book of Moses, Jeremiah, and Jesus. And what he does is to suggest that because of the brokenness of society, because of the barrenness of human souls, unconnected to divine presence, God's chosen must stand in the gap and divide somehow what people think is the right thing from God's will for society and community. That is to say that we are responsible for standing in the gap and providing another view, another perspective, another opinion that is connected to our faith in God. Cleophas LaRue's book, I Believe I'll Testify, is a work that describes the tradition and skill set of African American preaching. He devotes an entire chapter, Imagination and the Exegetical Exercise, to the critical importance of engaging spiritual imagination as a primary tool for the local pastor. LaRue believes that in order for the chosen text to be relevant for the people who are listening to the sermon, it must leap off the pages of the Bible and directly into their problems and crises, the pains and the proclivities of the people. His focus upon adding to the preacher's toolbox is important. The local pastor must have exegetical skills. That's why we have seminary. You must have honed hermeneutical capacity. You must have a depth of biblical studies, a scope of theological insight, and even some vision of the world beyond our faith community. But mostly, LaRue says, the local pastor must have spiritual imagination. It struck me that these two authors, very different from one another, one a theologian and another a preacher, were speaking with remarkable similarity. Those on the front lines, those whose work are inextricably interwoven into the lives of the least and the lowest, the left out and the unlucky, the front line men and women of faith, we will not fare well without prophetic and spiritual imagination. This is particularly true when it comes to race matters. For no matter how optimistic, positive, and faithful our perspective, something is wrong with America. Something is wrong with America, particularly when it comes to race. We have not done well in reckoning with and absorbing the shocking and painful incongruities of our racial past. From the start of the African slave trade, when 20 Africans arrived on a Dutch ship in 1619, to the horrors of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, it is clear that in America we have a problem. and that race matters. Now, what exactly does this mean from the local pastor, the local preacher on the front lines? I'm glad you asked. You know. Well, yeah. You know, that's a preaching ploy. You know what that is. Oh, yeah, amen. But I'm glad that the question has arisen. Because of the racial crisis in our nation, it is nearly impossible. No, really, it is impossible for the African American pastor to have anything else as the top priority on his or her agenda than the priority of race. This racial reality in which we live is within the very fabric of our people and community. In fact, it has been at the core of our existence from generation to generation. Our nation, our society, has evolved and developed the spurious notion of inequality and injustice based on race. For 240 years, the institution of slavery was based on race. For another 100 years, from the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863 to the Civil Rights Bill signed in 1964, Jim Crow and separate but equal ruled the day, and they were based on race. We have never created a remote effort towards a national reconciliation. So then, because race is such a factor, African American pastors and preachers must continue to offer healing, hopeful, helpful words that revolves around the effects of race more than anything else. And that's not a good thing. While we ought to be preaching and teaching about what the church can do for economic development in our community, while we ought to be planning and strategizing about what the church can do to strengthen the education of all America's children, what we ought to be blueprinting and building right in our church for the homeless and the helpless, we ought to find ourselves exuding so much of our energy to give hope to those bruised and vanished by all of these issues. But what we're doing is we're taking our energy and we're taking our focus and we're talking about race. And we're talking about race because these hundreds of years later, race still matters. Over 20 years ago, the social management expert of his day, Peter Drucker, wrote these words. A survey of the era that began early in this century, and he was talking about the 20th century, and an analysis of its latest manifestation, an economic order in which knowledge, not labor, or raw material, or capital is the key resource. A social order in which inequality based on knowledge is a major challenge, and a polity in which the government cannot be looked to for solving social or economic problems. The major problem, he said, of the new millennium, in which we're 16 years in, will be one of continuing social, economic, and political turmoil and challenge, unless we first address the challenge posed by a lack of knowledge. And he contended that the greatest divide in the lack of knowledge is the divide of race. 70 years earlier than Peter Drucker, the Harlem Renaissance poet, who I'm much more comfortable quoting than Peter Drucker, Countee Cullen, would write, I doubt not that God is good, well-meaning and kind, and did he stoop to quibble, could easily tell why the little buried mole continues blind, or flesh that mirrors his must someday die. Make plain the reason tortured Tantalus is baited with the fickle fruit. Declare if merely brute caprice dooms Sisyphus to struggle up a never-ending stair. Inscrutable God's ways are, and immune with a mind bound to a catechism too strewn with petty cares to slightly understand what awful brain compels his awful hand. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. Isn't that good? This poet, born over 100 years ago, possessed, I believe, both prophetic and spiritual imagination to maintain sanity and sensibility in a world gone mad with injustice and inequality. In his massive work, African American Religious History, a documentary witness, editor Milton Surnett quotes Lawrence Jones to end his introduction. He writes, by its very existence, black church history is a vigorous assertion that which we have to deal with in America is a vital pluralism, a national culture to which all races and creeds have contributed. In this sense, it introduces a reality principle into the self-concept of the Christian community and nation. He says that race factors from the very beginning of African presence on the continent of North America up to the first publication of his book. The book then shares 59 essays and speeches by some of America's greatest thinkers who were African American, covering a time span of 220 years. How amazing that each and every author in his or her own way struggles with issues related to race. Race factors. Race matters has been the mantra of the local pastor on the front lines of those in the black church since there has been a black church. While we should be utilizing and harnessing our impressive powers for the global purpose, ending world poverty, feeding human beings on earth, providing freedom and independence for masses of people suffering under dictatorships everywhere, it falls upon our lot in 2016 to continue to address and work towards eradicating racism in our nation, generation after generation. I don't know about anybody else. I'm getting tired of it, but can't stop. Currently, the swelling tide of hatred seems to be rising in America once again. From the vitriol spoken against President Obama by those whose hatred of blacks cannot be disguised, to the nagging and persistent reality of a growing chasm in academic achievement between children of color and white children, between urban public school students and suburban public school students. These are the pressing issues of the day. Evanston Township High School just gave a release on the reading average of their seniors. 97% of white students are reading at their appropriate level. 47% of black students are reading at their appropriate level at Evanston Township High School. New Trier High School's per pupil dollar spending for every single student at New Trier is $19,000. In Detroit, Michigan, the per pupil spending is $6,500. Something's wrong. Something is significantly wrong. And as a result of that, we have to harness our focus and our energy to continue to talk about race. The cry, I think, goes up from the country prophet from Tekoa, Amos, let justice roll down like rivers and righteousness as an ever-flowing stream. And then the cry goes up from the prophet in residence, Isaiah, comfort ye, my people. And then the cry goes up from the apostle Paul, with just one blood God has made all nations to dwell on the face of the earth. However you look at these texts and however you look at the prophets that spoke them, the issue for people of color is just the same as though we were being spoken to by those prophets of thousands of years ago. From every vantage point, from the lenses of this local pastor, the urgency of our times demands an outcry for liberation, independence, justice that can only come, I believe, through reconciliation. In his book, The Next Christendom, and I hope this is interesting for you, Philip Jenkins declares that by 2050, the majority of Christians will be people of color living in the southern hemisphere. The first wave of our faith stretched east to west, covering the northern hemisphere, where the majority of people are white. Christian growth exploded in its first 1,500 years across Europe and became headquartered at the very center of the empire that had attempted to destroy it. Yet every current indicator shows the growth and future growth is now occurring in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, it ought to be very clear to most that the experiences of these new Christians on these continents that are filled with people of color is not dramatically different than the experiences of African Americans in the United States. Their land was once colonized, and they were once victims of this awful system of racism. For the most part, they have achieved their own independence only in the last 50 to 60 years. The parallel experiences are remarkable. Exploited, abused, dehumanized, disenfranchised, and spoon-fed a hedonistic meal of lies regarding superiority and inferiority. With such suffering, the people were still not destroyed, nor did it dissolve their desire to be free. It did not damage their capacity for prophetic and spiritual imagination. There is no question that the growth of the church, the growth of seminaries like Garrett, for tomorrow will be on the terra firma that is neither European or American. I hope that we see that and begin to work towards trying to participate in that effort. So the challenge is this, and it is real, and I want to close on this. How can those of us who are local adopt a global view of our faith and God at work in a way that we've never envisioned? The only way that will ever happen is if we dare to use our prophetic and spiritual imagination, dare to hope, dare to believe, dare to see beyond the borders of your own existence. And I guarantee you, Garrett, that the only way it will ever happen is if we begin to meaningfully come together, black and white, those in the academy and those in the street, those who are educators and those who are not educated, those who are walking along the tree-lined paths of ivory towers like Northwestern, and those who are over on Church and Dodge. Unless we come together and work on creating a plan for reconciliation, to lay to rest the race factors that have divided us as a nation, we will not only fail to contribute to the growth of Christianity beyond this terra firma, but we will be unwitting participants in our own demise. So what are you going to do? Are we going to sit and talk and lecture? Or are we going to roll up our shirt sleeves and say the time is ripe to make the changes necessary so that our town can become one town out of the two? So thank you. I appreciate you very much.
I think we've been to church and heard the altar call. We have a great charge here to take and a great encouragement. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions. I want to invite all of you to join us for lunch in the side dining room over here in Loader behind this building. If you don't know where it is, ask someone you see going. We're going to have about an hour with Dr. Neighbors to have some more conversations, and let me welcome all of you who have come to join us on the campus for the lecture. Dr. Neighbors, we're going to let you take a few questions, and we need to pass the microphone around so we can get this on the video. So I'll run with the microphone. Questions, comments?
It reminds me of a Baptist church, too. I wanted to say that. Just about every seat is taken except the front row. Yeah.
How do you begin to approach these conversations without talking about reparations? So much of these issues are economic.
Yeah. It's a tremendous issue. I think the first steps that you have to take is a step that Garrett took last fall when they had a public theology course that Dr. Rector talked about, and that is taking students. Our issue for that course was on race, and those students then went out into the community and developed dialogue sessions on race at various institutions, bringing black and white together. If you start the conversation with reparations, then half of the folks will not hear anything else. So the first thing you have to do is you have to create an atmosphere where people are willing to sit down and share their story and listen to the stories that are also coming in their direction. And if you do that and begin to build relationship, I think the next step is to say, look at the inequity that exists, in terms of our economics. So.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your everything that you said.
Yeah, because you wrote a book. I saw you. You were taking notes. You were.
So you concluded by, this charge for reconciliation. I'm wondering, and maybe it's implicit in that, but if you can talk a little bit about our personal responsibility for self-examination before we come to the table.
Yeah.
Because reconciliation ultimately that's an empty exercise if you haven't examined your part in what's happening.
I appreciate that. Now, it's been my experience, and I could be wrong, but it's been my experience that whole self-examination, it doesn't work. That somehow the first step is sitting at a table with people who are different than you. So that the self-examination doesn't work because it's painful, and people don't like to inflict pain upon themselves. But when you're sitting in a circle, when you're gathered around, one of the things that occurred maybe a couple of months ago, I was at an amazing kind of race relations training session. They had an amazing exercise that they completed at the end. There must have been, 100 people in the room. And they had this exercise. They had a paper that had maybe 50 questions, and the questions were all very interesting questions, and they had to do with race one way or the other, but you didn't really know it. And the questions were, have you ever felt uneasy when you went into a bank? Have you ever felt uncomfortable when you applied for a mortgage? Have you ever driven down the road and felt a little uneasy when there was a police cruiser behind you? All of these. So they filled them all out, right? And then they gave a grading system to it. So you gave yourself 5 points, you gave yourself 4 points, 3 points, whatever. So the lower the point total, then that meant you weren't affected by most of these questions. And so they asked people from 0 to 20, please stand. And so a lot of people stood, and they were all white. And then from 21 to 40, everybody please stand, right? And all the way up until the highest number. And the last group of people sitting in this large room were blacks. All the whites were standing around the room. And I, foolishly, was the last person sitting because I gave myself the highest ranking for every single one. I'd been affected by them all. So I'm sitting there. So they come over to me, the facilitator, and says, well, how does this make you feel? I said, well, it makes me feel some kind of way. I'm not so sure that I feel comfortable with this at all. But I think it's that kind of experience in terms of coming together and visually seeing what privilege looks like, what white privilege looks like, that makes people say, oh my goodness, something's going on. I'd never thought about it from that perspective. Yeah.
I was in this very room last year that I came to a sabbatical lecture from Dr. Reggie Blunt.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the Freedom School. He had just lectured on the Freedom Schools. And I raised my hand and I said, Dr. Blunt, can you tell me how we can bring a Freedom School to Evanston? And he said, you don't want to know my answer. And I said, no, really, I do. And he said, then just do it. And the Freedom School will be here this summer. I say that to say, for I am a local pastor who has experienced pastored in many congregations. And I think that what happens oftentimes is we end up at this table and we want to reflect on how we do it.
Yeah.
Maybe we should get a group together to talk about how we do it. Maybe we should think about, well, let's examine, you have to just do it.
Yeah.
And the reality is when I walk into my churches, when I walk into my pulpits, I don't have the opportunity to reflect and say, how do we want to think about this? I have to just do it because our young kids are dying, because our people are in jail, because I have to go visit the jail every week. I don't have time to reflect. And I think that there's a place for reflection, but I also think there's a place and a time to just do it.
Yeah. Dr. Blunt, thank you for sharing with that pastor. Thank you very much. My. Yeah.
So just two quick questions, particularly when you were talking about that exercise, which is often used by the sort of anti-racist programs, which sort of work with the notion that the only way people can become sensitized to the effects of racism is by viewing the pain of black people. So what my question to you is there a way that we can come to the table that black people can be more than simply heuristic devices, with our only value being that we demonstrate something to white people and something other than simply that we're human? And two, as a critical sort of practitioner, is there a significant way that you can come away from your work with your congregation with a sense that, and I'm trying to think about how to say this nicely, but there's no nice way to say it, that their continual woundedness and pain is a mighty testament to the reality that most people who are inflicting that upon them or bystanding, and I'm trying to think about a nice way to say most of the white folk with who they deal in their everyday life, are anything more but amoral agents in the face of their suffering.
Okay. Well, the first question is, I think there is a way that black people can come to the table without having to spill their whole emotional story about what it means to be black in America and the pain that they've experienced. And I think that has to be intentional, and I think that it has to be proactive. And from what I experienced back in the fall with Dr. Frenchak, with the group, is that when we put together dialogue sessions on race, we created an opportunity for there to be safe space. So there really was safe space. And that's not easy to do, but you have to really find a facilitator that can be trained in that effort, and then you have to create some rules for the group in terms of dialoguing back and forth so that everybody's story is told in a sort of equal way. But the reality is, Dr. Ray, that what I still experience with that is that the nature of the story by blacks is in itself so powerful and sometimes so weighty that it still comes across as being the real big piece of this whole effort to dialogue. But I think that can be done, but it has to be proactive and intentional. And the last piece that you talked about, I think, the fact that we present ourselves as pastors before people who experience what you talked about so eloquently, the pain that they experience every day, whether it's on their job or whether it's at the mall. I mean, I can't begin to tell you guys the amazing things that just happens. And people say, oh, you sensitive. Well, yeah, I am. I like poetry. I am sensitive, I do like poetry. But in light of my sensitivity, the doggonedest things happen. I'm telling you. It can be dusk and I'm walking home. The church is on Benson. I live on Davis a few blocks away. It can be dusk and I'm walking home and I will see a woman who is a white woman who's walking on the sidewalk, and I will say to myself, before we cross paths, she's going to cross the street. I know it. And 9 out of 10 times, she crosses the street. And if I had enough time, I would just sit there and look to see her eventually cross back over on the other side after our paths cross. It's just I don't understand it. It's just one of those things. I can be in an elevator. It happened just last week. I was down in Chicago meeting with Lord have mercy, a lawyer, meeting with a Chicago lawyer. The only thing worse than a Chicago lawyer is a Philadelphia lawyer. So I had to go up to their office. Maybe it was on the 30th floor, one of those high rises. And I get into an elevator, and there is a white woman who is in the elevator, and she says, oh my goodness, I forgot something. And she got out of that thing like you would not believe. And I don't think she forgot anything at all. But I don't think that she was comfortable in that context. These kinds of things, you see, they happen all the time. I don't know if anybody here has experienced this. I'm driving down the road after dark, I'm driving down the road. There's a police cruiser behind me. I know he's seen me because we're at an intersection together. And then a mile, and then 2 miles. And then 2.5 miles. And then I'm grabbing the steering wheel and I'm clutching, you know, my knuckles are turning, I was going to say white, red. My knuckles are turning red, and I'm wondering, now what is this guy doing? And then all of a sudden, you know, they turn and go away, another way. And they turn and go another way because they ran the plates, and I don't have any outstanding warrants, I don't have any bills or whatever, and everything is okay. That's how I feel. And to be able to share that, so that's how I feel. You know, I'm a pastor of a church. How do you think the average person feels? You know, so these are things, these are stories that need to be told. And to be able to keep your sanity in the midst of that, and to still, you know, want to get up in the morning, you know, and kiss your wife and, you know, hug your kids, you know, and get them breakfast and all of that. That's nothing but God. That's nothing but faith in God that allows you to do that. And I'm preaching. I can tell. I'm preaching. I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop. I can tell you all. I'm sorry. I went there.
You can't help it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to lunch
Thank
and
you.
continue the
Thank you.
conversation.